What is the funniest story you have ever heard or read? Now, I'm talking about stories that are at least based in fact, not completely off the wall stories or jokes. Do you have one in mind? The reason for me asking about this is that there is a good chance that dramatic irony played a part, if not a huge part, in the humor of the story. Yes, we did talk about dramatic irony at the beginning of the unit. At that time, I gave you a definition along with all of the other types of irony. You do remember the other types of irony, don't you? There's verbal irony, there's situational irony, and structural irony. Now, for the next several slides, I want you to review on your own. You'll have the benefit of the cartoon slides that we've used over the past several lessons, as well as the formal definition slides. So go ahead and begin that now. The more you go over those concepts, the better it is for you when it comes to the test. Now that you've seen the title for today's lesson, you probably are beginning to understand why I asked you to think about that funny story at the beginning of the lesson. You'll find that the humor of today's story is aided greatly by dramatic irony. And, as I already stated, much of what we find humorous is due to the dramatic irony. But I do want you to understand that dramatic irony is not always used for humor. So let's turn our attention to this specific lesson. Let's begin with the objectives. We want to identify the tone of the story. We also want to classify the types of irony found in the story and describe their applications. We want to summarize then the author's purpose in the story. Just a moment ago, I mentioned that dramatic irony can be used for more than just humor. Of course, I prefer the humorous side. I just like to have fun. I really enjoy laughing at a genuinely funny story. But dramatic irony can also be used for the opposite effect. It can be used to create a scary effect in a story. Imagine with me for a moment about a scenario that is possibly familiar to you, the classic mystery story. Do you like mystery stories? I've always loved a good mystery myself. I suppose my first introduction to mysteries came from the famous Sugar Creek Gang series that my mom used to read to me. Later, I graduated to the Hardy Boys, and now I enjoy a good Agatha Christie, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, or even a G.K. Chesterton mystery. By the way, did you remember that the author of A Piece of Chalk in Unit 3 also wrote the Father Brown mysteries? Now, to set the stage for this mystery, let's take your typical house. Okay, so maybe this is not your typical house. That's better for this story anyway, because we're going to create a spooky, mysterious setting for this scene. It's best if we put the house out in the country, away from anyone who can provide help. It's just a standard part of mystery writing. You know. Anyway, our main character is a world-famous detective. The detective approaches the house, but we know something that he doesn't know. And that is where we find the key element of dramatic irony. Inside the house, our detective is going to find not only the body of our murder victim, but the killer is also hidden within as well. Now, since we know that the killer is still there, but our detective does not, this tends to create tension. We want our hero to be safe and solve the crime, but because of the danger that is clear and present to us, but unknown to him, we fear for his life. If this scene is described properly and the action is convincing, we'll soon be on the edge of our seats. We might even be hanging on to something or someone very tightly. And most assuredly, the pace of our breathing will increase. We won't calm down until we know that our detective is safe. And then a relief floods over us and we calm down. But in this whole process, the author has very convincingly communicated a clear message to us. But while dramatic irony is a great tension builder, it is also a great way to get someone to release their tension through comedy. This time I'm talking about intentional humor. In fact, a comedic author could write a story similar to the frightening one I just described, but he could make it humorous. This type of style would probably work best in a type of writing known as a farce. A farce is meant to be funny to the point of being absurd or nonsensical. So let's return to our house and our detective. This time we are going to describe the scene with comedy in mind. This time our detective is going to be a bumbling detective. He trips over himself, asks all the wrong questions, and even misses obvious clues. But remember, this is all written this way on purpose just to make us laugh. This time, instead of a killer lurking in the shadows, waiting to kill our hero, our detective is looking for the body of our murder victim, which happens to be hidden in a large chest in the main room. As we watch our goofy detective try to solve the case, we see him miss clue after clue after clue. At one point, he even sits down on the lid of the chest where the body is hidden, and he wonders aloud where that body could be hidden. This type of style and twist on dramatic irony would have us laughing instead of fearing for our detective's life. However, hidden amongst our laughter at the foibles of our detective's haphazard crime solving is an equally important message. Humorous dramatic irony appears frequently in literature. One doesn't have to be reading a farce to enjoy this style. It is an extremely effective tool. And the humorous use of dramatic irony is where today's literature begins. The author of the story today was a master of humor and dramatic irony. James Thurber wrote many short stories for which he has become famous. I think that watching a short video about this very funny author would help you to better understand our story.
Have you ever noticed that some people have a unique talent for seeing the world around them in a humorous light and then sharing it with others? You know, the people who can take a topic like drying glue and make their audiences fall out of their seats with laughter. I'm not one of those people. Usually my stories go something like this. So I got up early the other day and went for a walk, but I was tired and distracted and I tripped and hit my elbow right on the funny bone. Hysterical, right? Not so much, but what if I told my experience like this? It was dark 30 in the wee hours of the morning, a time I generally reserve for sound slumber, but as my neighbors had decided to hire a live percussion band to perform wild drummings from the heights of the rooftop, I decided to don my exercise clothes for an early morning constitutional. I managed to do this with my eyes mostly closed. As I stumbled out the door, my attention was drawn to the wild men from Rooftop Repairs. With their ruckus laughter and rhythmic drumming, each swing of the hammers seemed to fall not upon the roof, but on my poor head. So closely I observed them, I failed to notice other work in progress, namely, in front of the same house, where there had once been a sidewalk, there now was a gaping hole. As walking on air isn't an option for most of us mere mortals, I gave way to gravity and landed arm first onto a large piece of plywood. The resulting boom synchronized perfectly with the percussionist beat to create a glorious crescendo, which was promptly drowned out by my howls. Apparently my funny bone was not amused. So that might not have been hilarious, but it was better than the first version. That's the art of exaggeration, of finding humor in somewhat ordinary events of life. If you want to experience an expert exaggerator, read the works of humorist James Thurber. Many of his stories, including The Day the Dam Broke, are based, at least loosely, on real events. His memoir is full of stories about his unusual family, of his gun-brandishing grandfather who thought the Civil War was still going on, and of his petrified aunts who were terrified of burglars. One aunt would throw shoes down the hallway to startle intruders, and the other would pile valuables outside her bedroom door to dissuade thieves from chloroforming her in her sleep. Thurber's stories contain a lot of situational humor. The places, events, and exaggerated characters unite to make a humorous combination. Besides his quirky stories and essays, Thurber is also known for his cartoons. His unique style is partly due to his deteriorating eyesight. A childhood injury left him partially blind, a condition that worsened with age. The simple drawings combined with pithy sayings and social commentary were highly successful in the New Yorker magazine. If you're serious about humor, make sure to add Thurber to your reading list.
In today's story, The Day the Dam Broke, Thurber takes what would normally be a scary situation and weaves a hilarious story out of it. Now, when I say a scary situation, I really mean it, because the event that Thurber describes really did happen. You can check it out in the history books. That's what I did, and I discovered that the panic and the flood was real. Well, sort of. Before I tell you about this, let me ask, have you ever been in a flood? I can't say that I have ever been in a flood, but the town where I worked was cut in half by a major flood in 1999. The school where I taught at the time was out of school for 2 whole weeks, and our church opened a relief center to help distribute supplies to people whose homes had been flooded. The only way to rescue people was to use large army supply trucks. Nothing else could get through, except boats. In fact, I once lived literally around the corner from where this picture was taken. Floods are almost always devastating, but the flood described in our story by Thurber had the potential to be even more devastating. March of 1913 in Ohio was a rain-soaked month. During that long, rainy month, rainstorm after rainstorm passed through. Then, in the last week of the month, yet another weather front stalled out over central Ohio for almost a week. As the rain poured down day after day, the rivers began to rise, and the levees in nearby Dayton began to give way. This flooding caused extensive damage, and in the end, 92 people in Dayton lost their lives. Take a look at these flood pictures from Dayton. Here you see a bakery, and you see all the debris in the street after the flood has receded. Here is a picture of homes that are all flooded along the banks of the river. The river's in the far distance, but the overflow, the flood, has come into these neighborhoods. Only the railroad tracks stand up above, and that's because they're elevated. And then here's another street from Dayton, and you can see all of the debris and devastation from that flood. Now, the dam or levee that Thurber speaks of in the story did not break. That'll be obvious from the first lines of the story, but it was a real possibility. Now, I'm going to stop there and let you read the story for yourself. As you read, you may find it helpful to use ESL exercise 4C to help you identify the key elements of the story. After you finish, complete RSTP 4 right away. Once that is complete, you may resume the lesson, and when you return, I'll tell you more about the history and about Thurber's story. Could you imagine those hundreds of people running through the streets in a panic over nothing? Of course, it didn't seem that way to them. They were truly frightened by the situation confronting them. They thought that the dam had actually broken and that their lives were in mortal danger. Why would they think that? Let me give you the rest of the story that I was relating to you before you read. I had told you that the rain had been coming down on central Ohio for nearly a month, and there had been some local flooding, and that 92 people had died in a nearby town. As the month of March came to a close, the river that flows through Columbus was nearly 30 feet above its flood stage. That translates to billions of gallons of water every day. The dam that Thurber refers to is actually a gravity dam, which creates the Griggs Reservoir, the large store of water for the city of Columbus's water supply. This type of dam depends on its construction to counter the weight and pressure of the water pushing against it. This is how a gravity dam works. If a dam meant to hold back water was built straight up and down with its base the same thickness as the top of the dam, the result would be as follows. The water behind a dam pushes on the dam with enormous pressure. The taller the dam, the farther it is from the force of gravity. As a result, the dam would be less capable of withholding the force of the water at the top of the dam. The results would be disastrous. The dam would collapse. However, if the dam were angled with a wider base, then the gravity would pull down on the dam, giving it more stability, and the dam would actually push back against the water pressure. Since the Griggs Dam in Columbus was built in such a fashion, there was little likelihood that a catastrophic breach would actually occur. Still, when people panic, rationality is usually forgotten. And that's what happened in Columbus. Everyone was dwelling on the enormous amounts of rain, the flooding in nearby communities, and probably of other similar disasters of the past, like the Johnstown flood of 1889. All the people needed was one little incident to send their already heightened fears into a panic. And what was that minor little event? Well, according to Thurber, it was as simple as someone breaking into a run, a seemingly innocent action that ultimately affected the entire downtown district of Columbus, Ohio. Now, as for Thurber's account of this event, let's look at the techniques and style in which he tells his tale. The tone of this story should be fairly obvious, both from your reading as well as from some of the historical setting that I've given to you already. The story, as written by Thurber, does not match the serious and frightening potential of the historical events. Instead, Thurber sets a humorous tone for his story. Did you notice some of the humorous elements of the story? Let's take a look at a few of them. Thurber understates the potential danger as a way of revealing the truth. In his opening paragraph, Thurber describes the townspeople as being as safe as kittens under a cook stove. Now, you may be wondering how kittens would be safe or how they would even get under your oven. This is a reference to an old-time wood-burning stove. There's more space underneath there. The kittens are safe and warm, and the townspeople have that same degree of safety. They just don't know it. Thurber used hyperbole frequently. Even persons who live in towns no nearer than 500 miles to a dam. Inside of 10 minutes, everybody on High Street from the Union Depot to the courthouse was running. Thurber makes some comic allusions as well. Darius Coningway talks like Julius Caesar in the story. The cry of the townspeople to flee is similar to Horace Greeley's "Go West." And he even makes a reference to a mysterious voyage of the ship Marie Celeste. Thurber then uses paradox to create humor. I remember, however, that my mother turned out all the fires, that she took with her a dozen eggs and 2 loaves of bread, and this is in the midst of a panic over a flood. As you can see, the story is full of humor, but there is more to the humor. Much of the humorous tone is set by the irony. Were you able to locate the uses of irony as you read? While dramatic irony is a big part, it is not the only type of irony that is used. Let's take a look at Thurber's use of irony. First of all, dramatic irony. The reader knows that the townspeople are safe as kittens, yet he reads of their panic throughout the whole story. Also, there was a boy behind him on roller skates, and Dr. Mallory mistook the swishing of the skates for the sound of rushing water. Again, both good examples of dramatic irony. Then what about situational irony? Suddenly, somebody began to run. It may be that he had simply remembered all of a moment an engagement to meet his wife, for which he was now frightfully late. So the whole panic begins when one person starts to run. The townspeople think that he is running from the floodwaters. But in reality, he's running because he's late for a meeting, possibly with his wife. Another example is when the lieutenant colonel, do you remember that character? And he should be the leader in this panic, but he ends up taking advice from a little girl. Or there's the situation where The people cannot understand the militiamen, the soldiers, who are telling them that there is no danger, and they just keep panicking. What about the girl at the piano, and she is playing what song? Row, row, row. What do you use when you're in a flood? You try to find a boat, and you have to row your way to safety. And then finally, back to Dr. Mallory, who's running away after he hears the boy on the roller skates. Those are all cases of situational irony. Now, what about verbal irony? Well, back to the lieutenant colonel. Not only is he listening to the little girl give him commands, but then he turns around and he repeats the commands given to him by the little girl. And then there is the woman who is in the theater, and she is shouting fire when she hears the panic. But in reality, there is no fire because it's a flood that everyone is running from. I do hope that this story was an enjoyable read for you. But what exactly is the point of the story? Has Thurber hidden a message within the text of this humorous account? Well, there's two. One, while the story does reflect the poor judgment of a large group, Thurber is not being critical of his fellow townsfolk. He's not just making fun of them to make fun of them. He has more to the purpose of his story than just making fun of people. Instead, through humor, Thurber presents the dangers of jumping to conclusions and following the crowd and your own pride. So, there is something to be learned even in humorous literature. Consider how you respond to the crowd closest to you and also how you react to situations when they arise. Chances are that you will never face a flood from a breaking dam, or even panic from a false break. But if you follow the crowd into the wrong situation and your pride keeps you from getting out of that situation, you may suffer for many years, all for one foolish decision. God's word plainly states that pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. And with that, we are finished with this lesson. Take note of the assignment on the following slide, and I'll see you in the next lesson.